Diving Deeper Discussions, a program of the American Scientific Affiliation, where we focus on the journal of the ASA called the Perspectives on Science and Christian Faith. I'm your host, Randy Isaac. I'm delighted to have all of you here. We have a very special program here today. We are featuring a retrospective of an article that was published many years ago in 1984. And we are so excited to have with us ASA fellow historian Ted Davis, who highlighted this particular article as one that had a significant influence on him. And with his perspective as historian, he's particularly qualified to discuss the article and some of the background to that. So with that, Ted, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Randy. Let me express my appreciation to you for the big chunk of time I'm sure you're investing in making us making available for us ASA members these programs once a month.
You're most welcome, and it's my pleasure to do this with all of you. Now, as I look at the various participants that are here, my guess is that many, if not most of them, know you fairly well. But I also see a number of names who probably don't know you at all. So let's start the program a bit by, making them acquainted with you to some extent. So can you tell us, we know that you recently retired from Messiah, but where did all this start? Where were you born, raised? Was that Pennsylvania, or where did you come from?
I'm a native Pennsylvanian. I was actually born in the city of Philadelphia in what's now University of Pennsylvania Hospital a number of years ago.
Yeah. We can guess. Close enough. Okay. Yeah.
My family moved around a lot when I was a boy because my father was a Presbyterian minister.
Oh.
So he had different pastorates in the greater Philadelphia area, including New Jersey Shore.
Mm-hmm. So you didn't go that far from home?
No.
Yeah. Okay. So as you went on, where did you go to school? Where was your education?
I went to Drexel.
In
West
also
Philly.
Close to home.
Yep. It's only a couple miles from where I was born.
Right.
And I studied physics there.
Excellent. Good choice.
So, when I was in high school, graduating from high school, I knew three things about myself for sure. Number one, I wanted to be an astrophysicist. Kyle, that didn't work out. Number two, I hated the humanities. And that's one reason I chose Drexel over Wheaton, where I'd also been admitted, and as a liberal arts college.
Right.
And then I also would never teach. So,
three violated a few of those.
3 strikes
right?
and you're out. You learn a lot about yourself at a good college, and that's what happened to me.
So after you studied physics at Drexel, what next?
I did teach high school science and mathematics for a few years at a Christian high school in North Philadelphia. Mm-hmm. And then, which would have been at the time a truly multi-ethnic school, unlike many of the public schools in Philly at the time. And then during that time, I learned about ASA from a teacher, a longtime member, Frank Roberts, the late Frank Roberts, who was a geologist, trained geologist, and he also had biblical study background. He had a seminary degree. And he taught classes on all kinds of things, including science and the Bible, at another Christian school in the Philadelphia area. And it was through him and through continuing education efforts on the part of Christian schools in Philly that I became acquainted with the ASA, through Frank and also through the late Jim Neidhart, who was a regular speaker at these events that ASA sponsored. It used to be a New York, New Jersey section of ASA, and I would go to that sometimes with Frank, and Jim would be there. So that's how I got connected.
I remember attending a lot of his meetings, and Jim was a powerful influence on me too. And
his
repertoire of
some
books.
of the some of the younger members might not know who he was, but if you go to the ASA perspectives page and you do a index, do a name search for
Right.
Neidhart, which starts Neidhardt, I believe.
Right.
And you'll find zillions of articles, most of them really very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So I recommend that if you want to just kind of do some fun reading sometime when you sit down.
I agree.
And learn new ideas.
And that gives me a chance to plug the resources on Science and Christian Faith page that Terry Gray put together. It's under the resources menu on our website, and in the main search field, put in Neidhart, you'll get everything about Neidhart in the journal. So it's but that's a good suggestion. Keep going.
So then it was through ASA that I developed my interest in science and faith. I didn't really have any kind of formal interest prior to that.
Mm-hmm. So then you made it part of your life, huh?
That's right. As I was teaching high school, which I had always viewed as kind of a holding pattern to figure out what I really wanted to do long term, I decided that I wanted to do that. I wanted to work in science faith issues, and I wanted to teach these things at a college level. And so I needed to get the necessary credentials for that. There was no obvious route that one would take in those days to do doctoral work related to Christianity and science. Today, you can actually do that. You can do exactly that. You can get a doctoral degree in science and religion or science and theology. You can do it at a number of places. But back in those days, in the late 70s, there was no place at all where there was no route that was obvious to take.
You were a real pioneer.
And I was in that regard. I did get in on the ground floor for science and religion in terms of the scholarly work that's been done on it, especially in the historical field.
Right.
And so I decided, though, that I always had this interest in the development of scientific ideas. I'd studied some history of science at Drexel with a trained historian of science.
Okay.
And so I said, well, let's do that. And it worked out well. I really liked it when I got into it in graduate school.
Yeah. And certainly from a faith perspective, growing up as a pastor's kid, you were steeped in it, right?
Yeah. Yeah. But, my father liked science. He was an astronomy buff, but he didn't know any science really. He had studied history as an undergraduate and had done graduate work in addition to the seminary degree. He had a PhD. In those days, they called it a THD, Doctor of Theology, but it was in American church history. So he was actually a trained historian, even though he functioned as a pastor. He never had a teaching position anywhere. Okay. So I guess I got that ultimately from my father, my interest in history.
So about what year was that when you joined ASA?
77, I think, is when I
77. Okay, it's very
within plus or minus a year. That's when it would have been.
Yeah, very similar to me a little bit. So that's great. So let's see. How did the article you identified here? You say that grabbed your attention and had significant influence on you. So I want to get into that. But before you start saying that, can you tell us a little bit about Conrad Hyers? Who really was he? Who is he? And can you give us a little perspective on who he was?
I can't say very much. I never met him. I don't believe he ever was an ASA member, although you tell me he was a plenary speaker one year.
Yes.
What I can tell you is pretty much what is in the biographical section of the PDF version, the print version of the article. Right. I don't know if this is in the HTML version.
Right. No.
You know how the journal is set up
version. Right.
Down in here in the print version, it shows information about the author. I'll read it. Conrad Hyers is professor and chairman of the Department of Religion, Gustavus Adolphus College. He holds a BA from Carson Newman College, a BD from Eastern Baptist Seminary, that's now called Palmer Seminary, and a THM and PhD from Princeton Theological Seminary. His most recent book is a study of the relationship between biblical themes and comic symbolism, called The Comic Vision and the Christian Faith. His essay is an abridgment of several chapters of a forthcoming book called The Meaning of Creation, Meaning of Creation, Genesis and Modern Science. That's from John Knox Press in 1984, the year this was published. There's also, I should mention, a further set of excerpts in the very next issue of the journal, which is this. The December, his article's in the September 84 issue. And the December issue has an article that will also get mentioned in connection with one of the things you want to pursue, Randy, about the framework views. So
exactly,
I'll need to bring that in at that point. I'll wait to that point to bring it in.
Yeah, we'll do that. No, that's great. Let me just interject here a personal note, because I said he was a plenary speaker, and that was in 1986, and I had the privilege of meeting him because he was a plenary speaker at the Houghton College. Some of you are probably there as well. Kind of a curious and somewhat embarrassing story for me is that the two plenary speakers in that year were Conrad Hyers and David Myers. And with Hyers and Myers, I really appreciated both of their talks. I had burning questions for both of them. And I still remember excitedly pursuing Conrad Hyers and seeing and asking him my question. But I asked him the Myers question instead of the Hyers question. It's completely embarrassing. I got the two of them mixed up. So it was an embarrassing kind of time. But I did meet him. I did get his book. I have his book, and it's been very impressive. So this particular article and what he has to say has been very influential for me as well. So I'm pleased that you kind of picked this up. But so let's get into the article a little bit more, and if you want to say a little bit about how and why it's had an impact on you, or where you were in your own life, and what kind of broader impact it's had, we'd be very interested in hearing that.
Yeah, I'll tell you how that was in a moment. I just want to preface those comments by saying that this is the single most assigned article on origins that I have in my classes from my teaching career. I think I think it would be true, or nearly 100% true, to say that in every one of my science and religion classes, students were assigned to read this.
Impressive.
I put two things on a short list of things that if I ever teach anyone about science and religion, the students, if you will, or the participants need to become familiar with two pieces. One is this by Conrad Hyers. The other one is Galileo's letter to the Grand Duchess Christina.
Oh, yes.
And for those of you in this group, if you haven't read Galileo's letter to Christina, you're only pretending to be interested in science and the Bible and science and Christianity. You're only pretending. It's that important. It's like someone who wants to understand politics and doesn't read Machiavelli. It's that important. But the topic is not Galileo's letter today. It's Hyers. I rank Hyers as a secondary source. That would be my number one secondary source for students to encounter, whereas the number one primary source is Galileo.
Fascinating.
So now, why has it had such an impact on me? Well, one reason I've just answered partly, right, by saying I've used it in teaching so much, but also, and the students generally respond well to it. I don't mean necessarily they agree with it, but they, when they understand what he's saying, they think it's interesting. And many of them say, I've never heard any of this before. Now, that was my response to Hyers. I remember when this issue arrived in my mailbox, I remember picking it out of the mailbox. That's how influential it has been on me. I picked up the issue. I had just started my first postdoctoral job. I was at Vanderbilt University for 1 year, replacing a person on sabbatical. And I went the next year to Messiah. So this arrived in the mailbox. I looked quickly at, turned it over, looked at the table of contents and said, Dinosaur religion. I bet this is just another article about creationism. That was my initial response.
And then you read it.
And then I read it, and I had never heard anything like this. Anything even remotely like this. I had never heard it. Now, look, that just shows my ignorance of biblical studies as a profession, because my understanding from biblical scholars, many of whom I've talked to about this, there's nothing in Conrad Hyers' article that's original. Nothing at all. This was based on a book he had written for ordinary lay Christians. a book, on Genesis and science. And so he wasn't making a case for ideas that nobody else knew about. He wasn't trying to argue experts in his own field into a new position.
But he didn't have many references in this article.
Yeah. Well, he did present it in a highly effective manner, I think, a very engaging style. That's one reason I used the article. But he wasn't, this wasn't an earth-shaking revelation to biblical scholars. I now know that's the case, not just from talking to biblical scholars, but from reading a lot more about Bible and science and teaching it. There really isn't anything in here that's original, but it was original to me, got my attention. And, I wondered why I had never heard these ideas before. And here I was, right? I've launched a career to specialize in Christianity and science. I've gotten a doctorate relevant to that, not in biblical studies, of course, but I'd gotten a doctorate in history of science in this. I knew a lot of stuff that many people didn't know about science and faith. That's what you do, right? When you get a doctorate. And that's just normal for getting a doctorate. But I'd never heard of this guy, and I'd never heard these ideas. And so I was kind of surprised by these in a very pleasant way, I admit, but I was surprised. So and many of my students tell me the same thing, that they've never heard anything like this.
Wow. So let's move directly into what that new idea is. Most of the attendees here have probably read the article, but there are probably some who haven't. So pinpoint exactly what were these new ideas?
I'm sorry. You want me to talk, not them?
Yes.
Okay.
Not yet. We'll get their response later. This is you. What?
Right.
For you?
Sure. I had always I had been familiar with scientific creationism for close to 10 years at that point, because I had gone to one of my buddies in grad school. I spent 1 year in grad school in physics after I was an undergrad. And one of my friends from grad school was a young earth creationist who is today very well known in young earth creationist circles. He even featured in the film Is Genesis History. His name is Stephen Boyd. He teaches Hebrew Bible at, I think, the Masters University in Southern California. So he went from physics to Bible. And he gave me some creationist works in the mid-'70s. I took them home. I'd never heard these ideas before. I found them interesting at first. And in about 48 hours, I figured, no, this can't be true. And I returned the books to him with some thanks, and that's it. So I had very casually encountered young earth creationism, which Hyers writes about, of course. And I had also encountered a lot of concordism, of old earth creationism of various types, through my involvement with ASA primarily. And then some of my own historical reading. I encountered those ideas, especially in the great book, and I don't hesitate to say that, the great book by Bernard Ramm, the book, The Christian View of Science and Scripture from 1954. This is also on the final exam, by the way. This is required reading too.
Okay.
So in other words, what I'm saying now is this is the kind of background of ideas I had before seeing Conrad Hyers' article. I had never really found anyone to encounter the Bible in quite this way in relationship to the scientific issues. Someone who's basically saying, well, this isn't really about science at all, and you're misreading the text if you think it is. That's what Hyers was really saying, that to me was completely new.
Now, this is curious. You're telling me, okay, it was new to you at that time, and I think to me and many other people as well. And yet you say now you understand that it wasn't new to those who had the biblical studies in mind.
No.
Why wasn't it propagated more widely? I mean, was there a resistance to it, or what were the factors that kept it from being broadly known?
Well, let me just ask each person here without asking for a show of hands. How many of you studied a Bible course as an undergraduate?
Well, let's see. How can we ask here? I don't know how we can do that.
And if anybody cares to say, if anybody cares, I did not.
We don't have the microphones open yet. So
but I'm just saying, each individual, ask yourself, have you had a Bible class? And if so, it's unlikely you've encountered these ideas in a single Bible class, unless it was about Genesis.
Right. Okay. We're getting a lot of hands out there. So.
Yeah. How many of you have actually studied early Genesis from a biblical scholar at some point in your life?
Not too many. John is there.
Not too many.
We'll hear from him later. Yeah.
Not too many.
Okay.
So you're beginning to see why. I mean, this is a similar question in my view to why is it that so many people believe the following proposition, that medieval Europeans and especially medieval Catholics believe the earth is flat. Okay. I mean, that has no basis whatsoever in historical fact. It's the opposite of the truth. And yet very, very many people believe that. So unless you've actually had an encounter with history of science or history of thought, maybe you've had no opportunity to realize that the whole Columbus story is a 19th century fabrication.
Yeah. And that's really what we discussed last month. Unfortunately, you couldn't be with us, but
but if you were here last month, you know all about that. You know all about that, right? And you had it. Therefore, you had an encounter with someone who is learned in that, and you learned about the falsity of that narrative. And yet, many very learned people today in our modern world still believe that. I mean, a Librarian of Congress, Daniel Boorstin, wrote a book on the history of discovery. I forget the exact title. He has that narrative in there, the false Columbus flat Earth narrative. This is, one of the most learned American intellectuals there was. And Thomas Jefferson believed that Galileo was put on trial by the Inquisition because he believed the earth is round. Not that it moves, but that it was round. Jefferson actually wrote about that in his letters on religion from Virginia. So that's ridiculous. It's a ridiculous claim. But yet one of the most learned Americans of the 18th century believed that. So anyway, don't be embarrassed by what you don't. Don't be embarrassed by what you don't know. Right? Everybody doesn't know something.
So the core idea that you really that Hyers opened your mind and their eyes to was this notion that properly interpreted, the creation texts are not about science. That's the core issue, right?
That's right.
Now, let's fast forward.
Well, I should say that's part of his core issue. I would say his core issue is that Genesis is about monotheism.
Yes. Okay.
That's his fundamental claim.
That's a positive. It's not about science. It is about monotheism
science in any way, but it is about God. It is about monotheism.
It's a monotheism versus polytheism statement.
That's right.
So let's fast forward now. It's 45, almost 50 years. 40 some years since then. What has changed? Is it now kind of common, or is there resistance to this idea? What's happening in the field today?
Oh, well, many people know about this now. If they read literature on origins, they're likely to encounter it either by someone who likes the idea in some form or another, some broad form, or someone who doesn't. So an example of a couple people who are well known among many Christians who don't agree with this idea. One, of course, would be Ken Ham. Ham, in Ham's view, saying that there's any kind of context that matters for writing Genesis in terms of a polytheistic culture that needs to be opposed. He might agree that is partly what Genesis is doing, but he doesn't think that ancient way of speaking about things really has any influence on Genesis, as far as I can tell. And then another person would be Hugh Ross. For Hugh Ross, it's very, very important that the days be understood as sequential and as scientifically and historically accurate when properly understood. So that's not Conrad Hyers' approach. Ross doesn't care for the framework view, if you will, for example. Exactly. And that's ultimately what Hyers argues for, though not in this chapter. Yeah.
Okay, so that's a great kind of setting here, and I know many of you are eager to ask questions or speak up a little bit. So I'll ask Becky to allow microphones to be unmuted. I'd like to ask all of you as participants to keep your microphone muted unless I call upon you to ask a question. Then please unmute and say what it is and remute yourselves after you're done. So we're going to start with 4 people who submitted questions in advance and give them a chance to ask their questions. And I think I've seen most of them here. And so the first person with a question here was Del Kuhn. Always a reliable, dependable first questioner here. So Del, take your chance here.
Hey, Randy, thanks. And I wasn't expecting to ask the question. I thought I sent out my email. I just hope you talk about it.
Yeah, well, I told you we were going to have you talk about it too. But
okay. I'm in basic agreement with the article and the point of view, and I'm going to leave it to the historians to tell us what the alternative is being refuted. What I'm curious about is any suggestions on how somebody like me, who is, I hope, an educated Christian in the pew with no specific training in literature or the Bible, can bring the point up without coming across as somebody that's saying, well, the Bible says this, but it really means that. Because that's the type of person I think the pastors are trying to protect their flock from, maybe more now than in the mid-'80s when the article was written. So how do you get that across without putting a big target on your back that says we don't want this person to speak in our church because he's misleading us?
Well, you can't avoid that if you believe this is right, and if people in the church just are so upset by this that they don't want to give you a hearing. I mean, that's not on you. That's just part of the reality that we live with in some churches, that this may be the case. Now, I would approach that in this way. Give me a second to go into the other room and get something I didn't bring here for a minute.
Okay,
so I'll be
sure.
I'll be back in a second.
Yeah, go ahead. So I should remind people that I'm going to ask you to, if you want to speak or ask a question or say something, go to the reactions page. Depending on where you are, you might have to hit the more button and then get the reactions and click on raise your hand. Then I'll call on you and in turn. So, all right, okay. That was very good.
Let me tell you what I brought. And I hope that this will be the answer to Del's question. Let me just, at least it may sound indirect at first, but I hope it will be a direct answer when I've clarified what this is. Mm-hmm. The Bible that I use for my personal study is this one.
Archaeology Study Bible.
Right. You know, I mean, I'm fascinated with a lot of the archaeology and ancient history, and this Bible greatly illuminates that, in my opinion. It's my brother is an ancient Near East archaeologist, in fact,
yes.
And he was a major contributor
yes.
to this particular version of the Bible. Now, let me see if I can find what I'm looking for. Okay, I found it. If you go to the opening page of Genesis, of the text of Genesis itself, on the bottom of it is a short a few paragraph statement in the sort of sidebar at the bottom of the page. Okay. Mm-hmm. And this, I'm going to tell you who the author of this was, and then I'll read it. No, actually, I'll do it the other way around. I'll read a little bit from this, and then I'll tell you who wrote it. Creation accounts. It's the title of the piece is called Ancient Near East Creation Accounts. Creation accounts were commonly found in the literature of the pagan cultures of the ancient Near East, and some of them contained divergent narratives with common motifs. For example, all of the mythic creation stories of the Levant basically is Syria, more or less, and the Middle East, were polytheistic. A plurality of gods took part in the cosmic drama. Thus, one of the primary creator gods of Egypt was Ra, who was identified with the sun. And I could tell you all about that. I just got back from Egypt a few weeks ago. And Amun-Ra was all over the place. He was the chief god. In Mesopotamian cosmogony, not cosmology, Tiamat was the goddess of the sea and played an important role in creation. Creation myths were centered on the gods and often had the purpose of elevating and exalting a particular god to the head of the pantheon, etc. Okay, now I'm going to skip a bit And I'm going to go down to the last two paragraphs of this brief introduction. The Hebrew creation account in Genesis 1 challenges these pagan myths. It presents God as all-powerful, incomparable, eternal, and sovereign. It portrays a radical monotheism. That's a phrase used by Hyers, right? A radical monotheism in which there was no cosmic battle to bring about creation. There was no theogony. A theogony is a genealogy of the gods, if you will, saying that, this god gave rise to this one and gave rise to that one. It's a family tree of the gods, is what a theogony is. He says there was no theogony. The sun, moon, and stars are not deities, but mere physical objects set in their place and motion by God. The purpose, this is the final paragraph, the purpose of the Genesis account was not to elevate God to the head of a pantheon. It was to demonstrate that Yahweh stands as the exclusive creator and sovereign ruler of the cosmos. He is to be sharply distinguished from the creation, which, though thoroughly good, is nevertheless not divine. Okay, again, I'll read one of those sentences again. The purpose of the Genesis account, he says, was to demonstrate that Yahweh stands as the exclusive creator and sovereign ruler of the cosmos. That's the author's statement, right? This sounds like Conrad Hyers, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. Exactly like Hyers. Now, let me tell you who wrote that. That was written by a young Earth creationist. That may surprise you, but that's who wrote it.
Yes.
It's a man named John Currid, Currid. John Currid is a professor of Old Testament at Reformed Theological Seminary in Charlotte, North Carolina. And there's a lot of other, then it goes on to say more about his biography.
So in what time frame do you think he wrote that?
Well, you mean this when he?
Yeah, when did Currid? Yeah, when did that come out?
This came out in 2017.
Oh, so it's fairly recent then. Okay.
Yeah. So a young Earth creationist here, scholar. Not a creationist promoter like Ham, a scholar of the Bible with a PhD from University of Chicago. Right. A serious Bible scholar says that the purpose of Genesis is to demonstrate that Yahweh stands as the exclusive creator and sovereign ruler of the cosmos. Right.
Okay.
It's about monotheism.
Very interesting. Yeah.
So there's here you find this really wide agreement in the literature among Bible scholars that I've read subsequently to Hyers, that nearly everybody agrees with this. Right. In other words, what Hyers is saying is not in the least controversial. That this is what Genesis is ultimately about. It's about monotheism.
But as Dell says, it's really controversial in the pews of many a church.
Yep. And partly, I think, because Ken Ham thinks this is not an adequate view of Genesis.
Yeah, right.
He thinks it gives far too much attention to polytheism and pantheism, even though the Bible, according to nearly all of the scholars, that's what Genesis 1 is about. It's about debunking polytheism and pantheism. Hyers talks about this extensively in his article.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah. Now, we've got two hands up, and we haven't opened it up for new questions yet, but if you have comments on Dell's question in this particular response, then I'll let you go ahead and say something. Doug Hayhoe, good to see you here. You have a comment in this regard? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so my question is, how would John Walton's book, The Lost World of Genesis 1, and then his other Lost Worlds books, but especially the first one, which deals with Genesis 1, how would what he's presenting, would it be a development of Conrad Hyers? Would it be new direction?
In spirit, it's very similar to Conrad Hyers in this way. Walton likes to say this himself. He may have originated this terminology. I like it. He says, the Bible was written for us, but not to us. Meaning by that the audience for the Bible originally was a fundamentally different world than we live in, a different culture, different language, different customs, etc., different conceptions of the world. And yet there are things in the Bible that are intended for us, but they weren't written to us directly. And so that's what Hyers is saying too, right? He's saying there's things in this account that are really important for us to understand, but this wasn't written to us. This was written into the ancient Near East cultural context, and their common conceptions of how things are referenced all the time in the Genesis account. And then their conception theologically of what's going on is turned upside down.
Mm-hmm. So I guess what you're saying is Walton is in the same spirit, but a greater level of detail in terms of exactly what that ancient culture thought.
Of course. And I would dare say that without knowing in detail Conrad Hyers' educational background in terms of real detail, just in general outline, I would suspect that someone like John Walton knows far more about ancient languages in general than Hyers did, and far more about ancient culture than Hyers did. Hyers wasn't wrong. I don't think he was wrong. It's obvious that's the case.
Right.
But Walton is so much more knowledgeable about that topic, because Walton's PhD is in Hebrew and cognate languages, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And that puts him into the camp of those individuals who can read a lot of ancient Near East languages, and they can see the languages that predate Hebrew, for example, and see how words come into play. I mean, an obvious example of this is one of our own biblical scholars at Messiah, who has a PhD in Hebrew and cognate languages that he earned at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, at a Jewish seminary. He's told me that the words used for sun and moon in Genesis are etymologically derived from the names of gods in the ancient Near East. Okay,
Very
now why is that important in this context? Well, if you read Genesis day 4 carefully, you see that God creates the greater light to rule the day, the lesser light to rule the night, and then, of course, the kind of afterthought added, and he made the stars also. But the fact is, as you all know, the Hebrews had perfectly good words for sun and moon, and they're used a lot in the Old Testament. They're not used there. There's a circumlocution for the sun and a circumlocution for the moon. And that's consistent with this position that Hyers is arguing for and Walton argues for, namely that the Hebrews are debunking gods. And they're basically saying to the cultures around them, the big light in the daytime, and the big light in the nighttime, those are things that the real God made. They're not divine beings. They won't even dignify them by giving them those names in Hebrew that were derived from the names of gods in the ancient Near East. I mean, I think to me, that's a slam dunk to me as an historian. There's got to be an explanation for why the Hebrews avoid using the obvious words. They're referring to the sun and the moon. It's patently obvious. And yet it's also patently obvious that they're beating around the bush not to name them.
Right.
So, that kind of thing to me as an historian, that's slam dunk evidence.
It is. Fred, you have a comment in this regard here.
I was going to throw a monkey wrench into this. So quite a few words that we have a lot of thoughts about what they mean, they can have a lot of different meanings to different people. Like the word atom. So what I'm going to show you a picture. You see that picture? Okay, now look at the caption down there.
Can't quite make it out.
Yeah, please read the caption for us.
That caption is in Hebrew, and it says, Meshfachach Shal Adam Yari, which means the family of Adam of the forest.
And your point is?
What is that? Can you tell what that is? That's an orangutan.
Yes.
Okay. This is of a textbook that Israel Aharoni published in 1923 while a lot of Jews and Hebrews were trying to reestablish Israel. And a real important thing to do in that was to reestablish the names of different things. So this whole thing is a textbook actually for children. It's called a textbook for children about life. And this 1920, and he was probably the most influential naturalist of that time. This was written at the same time that the Scopes trial was going on in the United States. So while the
actually
Scopes
2 years later, the Scopes trial happens, but
Yeah.
it's leading up to it.
Yeah. So at the same time, the Scopes trial is trying to narrow the definition of Adam. A very influential Hebrew person is trying to expand the definition. I don't know if I agree with this or not, but
Okay.
I would just interested in what your thoughts are about that, Ted.
Well, the word Adam in Hebrew, again, this is, I'm not pretending to be a biblical scholar here. I ain't such, but I do read a lot of them. And so as I understand, the word Adam in Hebrew can mean various things. And one of the things it can mean is humanity as a whole. And from the earth is another meaning of the word.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. Thank you, Fred. Let's go on. We had another submitted question in advance. Luke Jansen, I see you're on here. Luke, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Okay. Ted, I want to thank you for putting this paper on the table for us to discuss. It's a very interesting paper. What it seeks to do, as many other essays do, is they try to reassure Christians that the two books are not in conflict and that biblical theology and natural theology, they're fully complementary. And many believers are comfortable in doing that, taking steps in that direction. They're learning how to accept the long age of the universe, for example. They're learning to accept the role of the happening of the Big Bang and what that does. And they're willing to accept evolution at various scales. I'm referring to stellar evolution and planetary evolution, chemical evolution, and even biological evolution, but only to a point on that last one, the fourth one. For many of those who take those steps and think, okay, I'm making progress, I'm becoming old earth in my thinking, human evolution is one step too far. For them, the scientific evidence that links us humans to chimpanzees and gorillas, for example, on the one hand, or Neanderthals and Denisovans on the other, as well as the scientific evidence for hominids acquiring a religious mind, for generating myths and religions, and then from that, the evolution of Judaism and Christianity and the scriptures that support both. Those lines of evidence are too much for many believers. And so maybe we could talk a bit about that. But to bring us to the essay was written in 1984, and so it would not have known about a lot of the genetic evidence and even a lot of archaeological evidence and other evidences that are speaking to human evolution. And that really does put a monkey wrench in a fair bit of theology.
Well, I think you're right about much of that. I would point out that Hyers' article, his chapter based on this book he wrote, this particular article is about Genesis 1. Really the 6-day creation story, which ends right in early part of Genesis 2. And so it's not about human evolution per se. It's not about any of the genetic evidence that we now have. It's just about how to read that particular part of the Bible correctly in his point of view. So that's that. In other words, the topic of human evolution, while really important in the origins controversy, is peripheral to his purpose in this article.
Well, Ted, is it really that peripheral? If his argument is broader than Genesis 1, that is really focused on the reading of Genesis needs to recognize that it is not addressing scientific issues. Inherently, doesn't that include the human evolution question?
Well, it would if you extend it past this narrative that he's talking about here.
Right.
He's talking about the 6-day narrative, and that does include, of course,
he didn't really restrict it to that, does he? I mean, isn't this a more general principle that he's talking about? If you say the general principle is that you need to read the Bible in its ancient Near East context, well, yeah, right.
That would be a principle he would want to apply, and so would a zillion other biblical scholars to whatever piece of the Old Testament you want to read.
Okay.
So I got the sense when I read the paper 2 or 3 times, actually, was that there was 2 parts, and the second part you're focusing on. That second part is that Genesis 1 is all about monotheism versus polytheism. But the first part, it's a shorter part, say a third of it, was basically saying, you know what, we used to get animated about the scientific issues and we don't need to anymore. And that's what I'm saying. A lot of people are okay to do that up to a point. And when it comes to human evolution, they are not okay with just relegating scientific issues to the side. And that's where I disagree with the article.
I agree with you. Yeah. That a lot of people are not going to like this. That's one of the biggest things my students object to.
Mm-hmm.
Is that this is taking it too far, in other words.
Mm-hmm.
Another objection students often make is the concretist objection. They want to say, no, I think there is some bearing, some relationship that one could place Genesis and science on the same page, if you will, that they think Hyers dismisses the relevance of science too much. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I think those are fair objections to Hyers. I don't share those objections, but I think they're fair.
Right. And since Terry just posted a comment in this regard, just basically questioning my claim about the that this article post-seeded genetics and an understanding of genetics, it was only in the very recent past that we've been able to pull out DNA from Neanderthal bones, for example, and Denisovans and others. That's a very new thing, and it really makes the case for for a common ancestral relationship that we have with them. And then newer ideas about how we're related to the chimps and gorillas. That's also since 1984 or 1980, whenever this was. So, but I think that's as much as I'll say.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let me comment on the earlier part of the article. You're right to point out that Hyers gets to this idea about monotheism a little bit later on, but the idea he really opens with, dinosaur religion, that's a term I still use in some contexts. I think he may have coined the term. I think what he meant by it is essentially the mythology, the religious mythology of scientific naturalism, the religion of science, if you want to call it that, under which one believes that science is superior to religion because science is about fact and religion is about belief, or the view that science shows that God doesn't exist, or science shows that the Bible is wrong. That's a type of dinosaur religion. You know, Richard Dawkins was just a professor of zoology when this was written. Nobody outside of Oxford had heard of him. But this predates Dawkins. It does not predate Carl Sagan. Carl Sagan is an early example of someone doing dinosaur religion in another type of form. But it's, you know, so this use of science to in a dominant way over religion. How's he put it here? He says, when evolution is taught in the public school or college classroom as implying either of these propositions, that is the proposition that you know, science is true, religion is false, that sort of thing, it is dinosaur religion. When certain scientists suggest that the religious accounts of creation are now outmoded and superseded by modern scientific accounts, this is dinosaur religion, etc. So it's that, it would be the third full paragraph in the article coming after that real long indented quotation, a couple paragraphs later. So if you want to go back and review that again, I think he's dead on with this. His observation as a scholar of religion, which is ultimately his specialty.
Right.
He's saying, you know, science functions as religion when it does those kind of things, when it believes it supersedes traditional religion and does those things better. That's dinosaur religion. And he's being deliberately provocative, I think, by trying to knock it down in the same way in which he thinks the Genesis authors were knocking down polytheism.
Excellent. That's a really good point. Thank you. We had another submitted question from Thomas Rogers. I don't see you on the list. Are you there?
I am. I was just
oh, there you are. Okay.
Muted and
all right, there you go. Go ahead.
So I maybe have a little different approach, but I believe that God deserves all the credit for creating. Okay. And in the question that I sent in, I referred to the 3 Nobel Prize winners in chemistry 2016 that had worked for 33 years to build some really minuscule molecular machines out of atoms. and they have to use like a solid gold surface. They have to work between 175 and 225 centigrade and so on, just to weave atoms into little circles to make little wheels and little axons and so on. Anyway, the best that they could do after 33 years' work is almost infinitely more simplistic than the simplest molecular machines made inside of us every day of the week. So I believe that it takes intelligent work to build our cell parts. And I'm prepared to give God all the credit, because evolution doesn't have intelligence to use. And its super intelligence is far beyond mankind's level. So I believe that, God's the only one with that much intelligence. He's the one that has to create our cell parts, cells, and us. And so I'm asking a question: Does the work of these Nobel Prize winners indicate that it takes super intelligence to build our cell parts?
Well, I'm gonna punt that one.
Okay.
And see if I can pass the ball to Terry Gray.
Okay.
So Terry, can you unmute yourself and respond? You're a physical chemist, right? Terry, you're muted.
I see that.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you have the professional competence to understand the work he was talking about. And I know you've thought about this question with regard to purpose, design, et cetera. So what would you say about this?
Yeah, I don't know that I have a good answer to those questions, and to that issue. I mean, I think that it is true that what we can do to manipulate the chemical world seems small scale to what you see in biochemistry and biology, but I'm not sure that addresses the sort of the fundamental evolutionary questions, and so
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah. So
Can I throw a little light?
But I'm going to have a good answer for that.
yeah.
Yeah. If we take a look at the DNA bases, fairly simple parts of our cell makeup, and adenine, I don't know, I would imagine most of you are familiar with DNA and some of its makeup, but adenine's made out of 5 atoms of carbon, 5 atoms of hydrogen, 5 atoms of oxygen. No, pardon me. 5 atoms carbon, 5 of hydrogen, 5 of nitrogen. Guanine is the same formula, but it adds 1 atom of oxygen. That is the only difference between adenine and guanine, and there are only 4 bases in our DNA. So first of all, these particular atoms have to be selected from our bloodstream at every cell construction site.
Yeah.
Okay, like where a cell's being built. These atoms.
Tom,
Yeah.
may I interrupt? I
Okay.
think we're going quite far afield from what this article covers and where Ted is. And I would just like to propose here that giving God the credit for everything that exists and created is not incompatible with the view of the evolutionary history at all. And in my opinion, and that the failure for Nobel Prize winners in chemistry to have reproduced the origin of life has no bearing on how God created life. And it really gives us no indication of whether God in his intelligence used an evolutionary process or not. So I would just say that no one knows how God created life. I think most of us here are in agreement that God created it. we're going to give him all the credit in the world. And for many of us, it's an ongoing search to see if we can understand a little better how he did. So look, maybe we could just leave it there and get back a little more to the article that we're discussing with Ted. But thank you for your question. Carrie Harmer was here from England. You're still awake out there, aren't you, Carrie?
Yes.
Why don't we see if we can get your question here, okay?
Can you just tell me where you're from in the UK, Carrie?
I live in Sheffield in the UK. It's fairly near the centre.
Right. Thank you.
This is it's been known since the 1960s that writing was invented around 3000 BC. If you don't believe that, look in Wikipedia. It's not a Christian article. And it was invented in a town about 50 miles from Ur, where Abraham and presumably his ancestors lived. Is there any reason to think that in this literate and advanced civilization, Genesis 1 wasn't written until 1,000 years after the invention of writing?
Well, I like your question a lot. I'll only answer again as someone who isn't an expert on ancient languages at all, or on biblical languages for that matter. I'll just convey what my understanding is from reading people who are. I would agree with you that Genesis, in the form at least in which we have it now, was not written earlier than these Akkadian stories may have been, that they predate Genesis by a substantial amount of time.
How do you know that?
Hmm?
How do you know when Genesis was written?
We don't. See, we don't know when Genesis was. I mean, I'm speaking now as an historian rather than a biblical scholar, but we don't. We don't know when Genesis was written precisely because we don't have those manuscripts. As I understand it, the oldest biblical manuscripts of Genesis, are they Dead Sea Scroll manuscripts? Are they already there? But I know the Septuagint predates Jesus by a couple hundred years or so. And it's Genesis exists there in a Greek translation form, but we don't really have those manuscripts. We don't actually know how old Genesis is.
But that's true. But one can make a reasonable hypothesis that the first literary text is they're known from 2600 BC, and one of those texts is about 3 times as long as Genesis 1. And it would seem to be reasonable that the earliest ancestor of Abraham would have written up their records and knowledge of God when and if they had a written language. And texts in Sumerian, so Genesis could have been written in Sumerian between 3000 BC and 2600. And I don't see any reason to assume that they waited 1,000 years before writing it down. I mean, the Greeks didn't and the Romans didn't.
Well, I don't know. I'm going to be an agnostic on that. There's something I'm less agnostic about, and that is the current form in which we find Genesis, which has, for example, the famous feature of the days in Genesis being described as from evening to morning. Let me bring in another Brit. Does anyone know Colin Humphreys?
Oh, yes, I know.
From Cambridge, right. Do you know this book?
Yes. Yeah.
Some of you may know this book. Okay. So according to the people he cites, he's read a lot of these experts on calendars and experts on Hebrew, etc., even though he is not an expert on the Hebrew language either. But he says that he points out, as far as I know, accurately, in terms of my own knowledge of the history of calendars, that the pattern of reckoning time from evening to morning is Babylonian. That the Babylonians began their month with the first appearance of the crescent moon in the evening sky, and they reckon their months on that basis. They have a lunar calendar, as the Hebrews do, and the Hebrews have the same one. So the Hebrew lunar calendar, beginning in the evening and ending in a morning, the daily pattern, that's a Babylonian pattern. Whereas an Egyptian pattern in the Egyptian religious calendar, not the secular calendar, but in the religious calendar that the Egyptians had, it's the opposite. The first disappearance of the moon in the morning, in the dawn. And so the Egyptian pattern is morning and evening, not evening and morning. Now, to me, that says something. That says to me that Genesis was put in its current form in a Babylonian context, not in an Egyptian context. And so if the story originates with Moses, as tradition holds, and Moses is coming in an Egyptian context, Moses would have spoken about morning and evening, not evening and morning. That would have been the cultural context, the calendrical thinking in Moses' mind. So the Hebrews take their calendar and their way of speaking during the Babylonian period. So I think this text takes its current form during or after the Babylonian captivity. There's other reasons one could argue for that, but that's a science-based reason that one could use to argue for that.
Okay. I'm not familiar with the American method of classifying courses and so on, but you said scholars of Hebrew and cognate languages. Mm-hmm. Does cognate languages include Sumerian and Akkadian?
That's right, they do.
Yeah. Well, what is the reason for supposing that Abraham, for example, and didn't write up his accounts and knowledge of God in his own language, Sumerian?
I said I'm going to be an agnostic on that. I don't have enough thought in my mind to comment on it.
Yeah, we don't have history. We've got a couple of hands up on this topic, I presume. Tim and then Terry. No, this is different. Tim, is it on this topic? Okay. If not, then I'll say that we've concluded this question. So we'll end the session of the submitted questions. We're going to open it up for broader discussion of what any of you want to bring up. Of course, again, just raise your hand and we'll get you in line and we'll get you queued up. So, Tim, you were on there. What happened? Go ahead, Tim, because you were up there first. Tim Hugh.
Hi, yes, sir. So my actual, I was just kind of preemptively raising my hand. About the article and the thrust of the article, and that was there's an emphasis here of saying it's not science. I also wonder if I couldn't quite tell whether the author was talking about it not being history in the way we often think of history. I'd been told by some scholars where I used to teach that one through Genesis 1 through 10, or maybe they said 1 through 11, were not considered history the way we tend to think of history, and that history, at least in more like what we think of, begins, I think, maybe with Genesis 12. So if that's so, that's another layer of rethinking how to read Genesis. If it's not a book of science, and in some ways is not exactly a book of history. So I may be misreading what the man said. So straighten me out.
Well, to see more about what Hyers thinks of the manner in which biblical history is being written, you could read the sequel, the one in the December issue of the journal, where he talks about this extensively. I haven't reread that recently, so I'm not going to try to summarize it, risk mis-summarizing it. But my own view would be that as a historian, that the way we write history today is fundamentally different from the way they wrote history in the ancient Near East. The sequence of getting events in sequence doesn't matter very much to the ancient historians. This is one reason, for example, that I think a lot of the events in the Gospels are not presented in historical order. until maybe you reach the Passion Week, where the time period is very small. Maybe that is sequential, but a lot of the other stuff is probably not sequential. And you're aiming to do a certain thing with your history and make a very specific kind of theological argument in the case of the biblical writers. So, one gospel author might have the Gentiles as a primary audience, another one might have the Jews, another one might be writing, like John, more apocalyptically almost, about things. So, I'm just going to say that they wrote history a lot differently than we tend to write it today. It is problematic in that regard to say that the first 11 chapters of Genesis are historical, because in a modern sense of historical, they're not historical at all. But that doesn't mean that none of those things happened. It's just a question about how they're written down and how we have to approach those texts. Okay. I'll share my brother's view. Again, on this one, he's an expert. He's an ancient historian specializing in Middle Bronze II, for any, whatever that means. For some of you know what that means. And in his view, the chapters prior to Genesis, prior to Abraham, are in fact much more questionable historically than the ones after Abraham. To be specific, he thinks that Abraham's stories could not have been compiled later on. As the older view of many biblical scholars was that Abraham and much of the rest of that early part of the Bible were written a whole lot later by people who didn't have any firsthand knowledge of the time. In his view, the stuff about Abraham matches what the archaeological record says about that time and that place. And so that somebody writing in, say, 500 BC couldn't have known any of that. And so he thinks that the historical kernel of Abraham is very, very high, if you want to put it this way. Whereas some of the stuff that's earlier than that, it's written in such different manner than the stuff that comes later. You have to make some judgment about literary genre. And that's ultimately what Hyers is saying. To understand Genesis, you have to make a judgment about literary genre. So let me go further with that and read something out of an old set of notes I have. I've mentioned this book and given it much praise earlier, even if it was very brief mention.
Right. Bernard Ramm.
Yep. In 1978, I heard Bernard Ramm speak at a local ASA meeting, I think at what's now called Eastern University. I think that's where it was, near Philly. Ramm it was called The Christian View of Science and Scripture 25 years later. He was kind of updating his thoughts. And he said a couple things that I want to share with you. One is, this is a direct quote from him: "The fundamentalist mentality is far more ingrained in American evangelicals than I would ever have imagined." He meant at the time he wrote the book. That's one thing he said. And then he went on to say that interpreting parts of scripture in terms of literary genre is very, very important. So he's sounding like Hyers in terms of literary genre. So how are you going to interpret Genesis? Well, it's going to have a lot to do with what you think the literary genre is.
Okay.
And that ancient Near East background for Genesis comes in here, because when you're in the ancient Near East, you write about matters of origin in certain patterns. You think and write about them in certain ways. Just as in modern history, we think and write about history in certain ways that they didn't use in the ancient world. And they wrote about the world in different ways then than we do now. And so, to be understood at that time, this is what you did. You spoke about origins in this way in the ancient world. And so the Hebrews were doing that. They were taking the common manner of speaking about these things and using it themselves to create a fundamentally different way of looking at the world, namely monotheism.
Right. Okay, that's good. Let's move on and see if we can include a few more questions here. Carrie Gray, you're next.
Hi. Ted, I'm going to try to get you to say something.
Put words in his mouth.
I don't know if you will agree with it, but or maybe get Hyers to say something. But it seems to me that when you read Hyers and accept his position, that more or less you're saying the Bible has nothing to say to us with respect to the scientific claims, with respect to cosmology, with respect to old Earth geology, even with respect to evolutionary theory. I'm going to draw the line just to make it easy for us, I think, with human origins, humans as humans, as a man created in the image of God. And we can explore that a lot if we want. But what do you think of that? Are we coming to a position here with Hyers' view and with your stamp of approval on Hyers' view that the Bible has nothing to say with respect to this other than God is the creator?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't put it that way myself, that the Bible has nothing to say other than that God is a creator, because that sounds like it's a minimalist claim. I think the claim that God is a creator is a maximalist claim. It's a claim that God has made everything and that God has made us.
I mean, I'm okay with that.
Yeah. Okay. But that's in the context of polytheism and pantheism, which is what Hyers argues. He's persuaded me, at least, what Hyers argues is the context here. That's a maximalist claim. There's nothing minimalist about it at all. It's saying that everything you guys are thinking about all this is all wrong. It's all wrong.
But is there anything at the scientific level?
But it's maximalist with respect to the theological claim, right. But does it have anything to say with respect to the science of cosmology, the science of geology, the science of evolutionary biology?
Well, it would have something to say about interpretations, philosophical interpretations of those scientific views. Certainly, I think. For example, when the evolutionary biology claim, many evolutionary biologists, probably most, believe that when they say that evolution operates on, in a classical Darwinian picture at least, evolution operates on random variations, and natural selection works with that, and that it's randomness all the way down. Many of them, I think, believe that they mean philosophical randomness all the way down, that there's no such thing as any purpose in the universe and that sort of thing. Now, the science doesn't show that at all. It doesn't show it at all. There's a splendid essay by Stephen Barr, a prominent cosmologist and Catholic, founder, in fact, of our parallel organization, Society of Catholic Scientists. Steve Barr wrote a wonderful essay about this in First Things, I think in 2012. It's called Chance, by Design. That's the title of the article. So if you want to look for that, Stephen Barr, Chance, by Design, you'll find it easily. It's on First Things website. Originally, it was in print. And he shows, to my satisfaction at least, that these evolutionary biologists are just fundamentally confused about what randomness means. Now, he knows a lot more about this than they do, frankly, not about the evolutionary biology, but about mathematics. He's a mathematical physicist. And so when you claim that something is random mathematically, you mean certain things and you don't mean other things. So it's overreaching for evolutionary biologists to claim that randomness is the way the universe works, if they mean philosophically, that everything's by chance, nothing has a purpose. It's going well beyond any of the science that they're doing. They don't realize it, but that's what they're doing. They're going way beyond science. I think Barr is right. And then and Barr in that same article has some wonderful passages from Thomas Aquinas about contingency and necessity in nature, and the use of the creator of contingency and randomness. And so these are wonderful things. I recommend them to everyone in ASA to go look up the article by Steve Barr.
Okay. All right. We've got only 10 minutes left, and I want to get the remaining questions here if we can. Luke, you've got another question here.
Well, just a quick underlining, and then I'll get to my point. Underlining, if for those who have the idea that evolution is all about single point mutations and that they're random and individual mutations, that is a very old idea of evolution. There's a whole new understanding that involves major changes that are pre-programmed. I'm just going to underline what that Ted kind of mentioned that, and I think people, if your understanding is of evolution just being single point mutations and on a random basis, then there's a lot of more reading that needs to be done. But my question, Ted, is this. You say the main point of the article is about polytheism, monotheism, and syncretism, and I just wanted to talk a bit about that. So monotheism is the idea that there is only one God, and I certainly agree that Genesis 1 is poking fun at the other gods, the sun god and the earth gods, that sort of thing. So making fun of those other gods and saying that Yahweh is the supreme God. But that's monolatry. It's not monotheism. It's monolatry. That they put Yahweh above all the other gods, and doesn't deny the existence of those other gods. And the reason I wanted to just mention that is because, I mean, just a couple chapters later, when you get to the Tower of Babel, you've got the divine council, and right away, then again, you've got this whole idea of multiple gods. But God is the supreme God, but he still has to work within his divine council. Abraham was not a monotheist. His family that walked through the desert with him were not monotheists. Israel struggled with polytheism for a long, long time. And then the last point, syncretism, the whole history of the Jewish and Christian faith is all about taking in ideas, not just worldview ideas, but also theological ideas from the Egyptians, the Persians, the Syrians, the Greeks especially. So I'm just challenging that idea that Genesis 1 does away with syncretism and does away with polytheism.
I would accept both of those points, particularly the one about henotheism. That the story of monotheism in the scripture is a long story, but if you accept my view that, and the view of many biblical scholars, that the current form, we have Genesis in its current form, Genesis 1 in its current form, from the Babylonian period or nearly or shortly thereafter. That's after the Hebrew prophets have been proclaiming monotheism for a few hundred years. And it's fairly late in the development of biblical Jewish thought. Of course, there's further development of Jewish thought in the apocryphal books in the interim between the Old and New Testament. But I would accept that there's a narrative there. But the narrative that this is the God that made these other things, that seems very clear in reading Genesis. I think Hyers hits that right on the head correctly.
Right.
That this is that passage, that Genesis day 4 to me is the crucial day when the sun and moon aren't even named. Those are just things in the sky. When those things in the sky were the dominant gods of everybody else around them, the Egyptians, the Babylonians, all the other people in the ancient Near East, they believed in the divinity of those things. And of course, astrology originates in Babylon, and it originates around the view that the stars are divine beings, a view which Plato also shared, but that the stars are divine beings and they control our destinies. And when the Hebrews say, oh, yeah, kind of, by the way, yeah, he made the stars too, that's a very serious debunking of the claims of deterministic astrology. That's partly what's going on there, I think.
I'll agree with I'll agree in principle with most of what you said. I just want to emphasize there is a difference between monotheism and monolatry, and it's worth clarifying that. So
Sure. Thank you, Luke. Joe Letzner.
Yes, hi. I wanted to mention a view that was put forth by Meredith Kline in the 1950s, I think. He sees a parallel between the Torah and treaties that existed in the ancient Near East, contemporaneous with Israel. And the part that relates to Genesis 1 is that these treaties always begin with identifying who the king is and what he's done for you and why you owe this king your loyalty and obedience. So this is your king, Yahweh, God. And he made everything there is. He made the trees that grow your food. He made you and he has every right to expect your love and obedience and loyalty. And he goes on through the 5 books of the Torah. What does this king expect you to do? There's 10 commandments and all of Leviticus. And at the end of the treaty, there's a requirement that everybody get together and agree to ratify the treaty. And that's what happens in the last chapters of Deuteronomy on the mountains.
Okay.
So it puts...
Your question is?
Well, what does Ted think of that?
I don't know anything about that view of Meredith Kline. I won't comment further, but Randy had a question he wanted to see get in about Meredith Kline, a different question. Maybe we should go there, Randy.
Well, it's just, I think it may have even been in the same article, but I'm with Joe that the suzerainty treaties and so on were a key part of thinking there. But Meredith Kline had his 1958 article in the journal about the framework theory, which there seemed to be a number of parallels with what Hyers is saying. So I was asking there, does Kline's thought feed into this? Did that affect Hyers? He doesn't reference them at all. Or what are the similarities and differences between Kline's view and Hyers' view?
Well, there'd be probably many differences at the lower level if you get down into the nitty gritty. Kline, every biblical scholar has their own nitty gritty about how what this particular reference is in the scripture versus that one. And I don't really want to chase down that rabbit hole here. But for the second article that Hyers I've mentioned by Hyers, this one in the December issue, that you could easily go back and read if you want, you will see that he basically does endorse a framework reading of Genesis, even though I don't think he calls it that. It's a reading in which he stresses the parallel nature of the triads of the 3 days, if you will. And the idea that God, what Hyers also stresses is this. He says, in the Genesis account with Genesis 1 verse 2, let me quote it in the old King Jimmy version, because I knew King James pretty well. And so it goes like this, it goes, the reading says, so the first verse, how's it go? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved across the face of the waters. So he says in Genesis 1 verse 2, we're faced with 3 problems here from the Hebrew point of view, 3 problems. Water, which for the watery deep, which for the Hebrews has bad overtones, and chaos, and an unformed darkness. And you have darkness. You have the chaos, the unformed earth, the watery abyss, and the darkness. And that's bad things. Overtones are bad for the Hebrews. So this is kind of like the film Jaws. When you read Genesis 1 verse 2, you hear it dead and is happening as you read these 3 bad things going on. And God then deals with each of these things. First, God deals with the darkness. Then God deals with the watery chaos. He separates the waters above the firmament from the waters below it. And then he deals with the formless earth. So God deals with these 3 problems. Then he also talks about the parallel structure of each of the first 3 days and the second 3 days. This is framework view material, even though he doesn't call it that. Now, does he get it from Kline? I don't know. I would say probably not. Kline didn't get it from Kline. The framework view is old. It's found in explicitly that form as early as the 1860s. And in the United States, it becomes well known in the first decade or second decade of the 20th century because of the work of one of the leading fundamentalists in England, a man named Griffith Thomas. And he was admired by American fundamentalists, and he taught the framework view with the parallel triads in there. So this view is old, much older than many people realize. It predates the Dutch, whom Kline gets it from. Kline gets it from some Dutch scholars in the 20s, but it predates them by decades. And so this view is out there being discussed in the biblical literature.
That's interesting. I didn't realize that. What was his name again? In the 1870s, you said?
Well, let me tell you where I've seen it. So I'm going to have to go find a PowerPoint, but that shouldn't take very long.
Yeah.
It might take us past 3:30, Randy.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
If you want the answer, I'll get it, and you can end there if you want.
Okay. Yeah, I think it might take too long here. So, okay, so we can put it in later. So I have to apologize to those of you who still have your hands raised, because we do have an agreement to stop at 3:30, and we end anywhere between 3 and 3:30. So at this point, let me simply take the time to thank all of you for joining, and particular appreciation to you, Ted, for taking the time to join us and to share your insight and to give us another historical perspective of the significance of articles in the journal, such as this one from Conrad Hyers. I've learned a lot here today, and I really appreciate it. So with that, I look forward to seeing all of you on July 9, and we'll continue our discussion there. So thank you all very much. Goodbye.